In Taiwan, the Guomindang inherited a society that had been prepared under the Japanese rule for modernization. Meiji Japan had won control in 1895 following the First Sino-Japanese War. The islands were home to a few thousand original inhabitants who'd been pushed off the broad floodplain on the western half by the gradual trickle of Chinese settlers beginning in the Ming, as you have read about. By 1885, though, that population had grown to around 3 million, and under the Japanese rule, Taipei was used as the administrative capital. Investors built schools, universities, railroads, and sugar mills, and by the early 1900s, Japanese administrators had conducted an extensive land survey that became used for efficient taxation and to create land reform. Non-cultivating landlords were paid with public bonds for their domains, which were then sold back to farmers who could live and work off the land. Taiwan would avoid the cycle of agricultural crisis, deforestation, debt, exploitive landlords that had ruined the rest of China in the 20th century. Already by 1945, most Taiwanese, or Taiwanese Chinese, by this term we mean the descendants of Chinese settlers, had brick farmhouses with electric appliances and at least an elementary school education. The return of Taiwan to Chinese rule in 1945 saw the Guomindang treat the liberated population as disloyal and enemy collaborators, not to be trusted. Pogroms carried out against the local elite with nearly 10,000 killed in a few months would allow the new arrivals from the mainland to simply plant themselves at the very top of the island's social and political hierarchy. Still, the Guomindang deserves some credit for righting the ship after that. In 1949, Taiwan was on the verge of economic and political collapse. Humbled by the Civil War, Chiang Kai-shek embarked on a campaign to cleanse his party and the government of corruption and thuggery. In the economy, Chiang treated a socialist approach to planning and controlling heavy industry through the National Resource Commission, which was staffed with engineers and industrialists at the very top who had just returned from training in the United States. Focusing on exports and later electronics and petrochemicals, Taiwan's economy grew by supplying the U.S. military efforts in Vietnam and having access to very developed industrialized nations like post-war Japan. In education, Taiwan benefited from the transfer of institutions like the Academic Sinica and professors such as Fu Xinyan to the islands to resume their work. Expelled from Mao's China, thousands of American missionaries and their funding and resources arrived to found Christian colleges, hospitals, and training programs. The American missionary network that was once dispersed all over the nation of China then took these same resources that were now concentrated in a much smaller area with a smaller population, and they had a greater impact. But in the 1960s, Taiwan was home to excellent universities and a very skilled but cheap workforce. A third area is that the Guomindang finally gave its full attention to rural areas and their problems. Building on the foundation set by Japan and funded by the U.S. Congress, it launched the Sino-American Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction. In a few years, Tennessee had been virtually eliminated altogether, and now farmers took on debts not to pay rent, but instead to buy new fertilizers, ag machinery, or to invest in their own land. The revitalization of the Guomindang that took place in the 1950s and 1960s did not mean it relaxed its draconian methods of stifling dissent. Despite being known to Americans at that time as Free China, the bulwark against communism that stood against the mainland and Mao, Chiang Kai-shek often invoked martial law for several decades and used police to intimidate students, artists, and middle class that often took to the streets or wrote newspapers to voice their criticisms. A great example of this is Hualin Nie, a novelist that would go on to be one of the most popular Chinese authors in the 20th century. Her book, Three Lives of China, is one that was originally assigned for this course when we were thinking about doing our film and our novel exercise as one of our writing assignments. Despite fleeing the communist revolution to Taiwan, Hualing's participation in a literary magazine in the 1950s that was critical of the government's repression of other intellectuals in the middle class led to her being blacklisted and barred from working under her own name in print. Her male colleagues at the journal actually were sent to prison, and the only reason that she was still free was because her father had been a member of the Kuomintang Party in the 1930s and was murdered by agents of the Chinese Communist Party. Given the chance in the late 1960s, Hualing escaped to the University of Iowa, where she helped found the International Writers Program, and in the 1970s and 1980s brought scores of Chinese filmmakers, poets, journalists, and authors from both the mainland and Taiwan to be reunited in the United States and to work towards a peaceful reunification and end to the Civil War. Only after Chiang Kai-shek died did his son succeed him, Jiang Jingguo, in 1975. And then the political situation became slightly more tolerable. By the late 1980s, the island's increasing middle class and its prosperity from its growing, booming economy, one of the little dragons of East Asia, forced the relaxation of controls and the gradual emergence of a true democratic society with new political parties and civil liberties. Historian John King Fairbanks once warned against comparing Taiwan and the mainland after 1945, given several factors. One, its size, and two, its unique historical experiences. Taiwan is a small area of China that has been the recipient of vast amounts of American, Japanese, and also other foreign investment, which improved public hygiene, healthcare, the educational system, and created a modern infrastructure in banking, industry, and transportation. Taiwan was also protected at various points in history by the British, the Japanese, and the American navies, subsequently the three most powerful across East Asia's waters in the 19th and 20th century. And it also escaped the horrors of the Second World War that befell the rest of China's mainland coastal areas. The burden of governing 20 to 30 million people in Taiwan versus that of a population that rose precipitously from 500 million to over a billion in mainland China also make it difficult to have fair historical comparisons. One of the critical advantages Taiwan had after 1949 too was that it was never taxed to meet the needs of other provinces that lagged behind in terms of development, something that we see inside mainland China. When one area is doing well, often resources and revenue is siphoned off there to help fund projects in areas that are struggling or areas that are impoverished. As one small unit within the larger orbit of China, Taiwan raises interesting questions about what could have happened to the rest of the nation had it been divided into several smaller states, like we see in Europe. And yet, the economic miracle of mainland China in the 1980s and 1990s, that we'll talk about later in the course, also speaks to the ways in which the nation's size is still an incredible asset in the modern world. Okay, that wraps up our kind of brief lecture highlighting some of the major points about the Chinese Civil War and the retreat of the Kuomintang to become the Republic of China in Taiwan. Hopefully you're all doing well. Stay abreast of announcements and other happenings from the university email. Please send your questions to me about any upcoming exam or assignments that you're worried about. And also just in general, be well and be safe.